Working as an investigative journalist over the last decade, my work has pushed me to host a radio show, write books, and produce numerous documentaries about the realities of child trafficking, the dangers of technology, and indigenous struggles. Now, I aim to uncover whether there exists a network of individuals and institutions which ties these issues together. Many researchers posit the existence of an international cartel which covertly manipulates world events for their own benefit. Are these claims simply fantasy and paranoid delusion, or is there truly an agenda to manipulate humanity to the demands of the pyramid of power?
Chapter 1. Big Education. Public schooling is a ritual that most children endure the most impressionable years of their lives. While the assumed goal of public education is to educate the children so that they become the doctors, teachers, artists, and leaders of the future, some suspect a more sinister agenda is at play. Some believe that mandatory public education has become the tool for the governments of the world and the education organizations which advise governments to influence and manipulate the opinions of the youth. So how accurate are these claims? Is government involvement in education a flawed attempt at achieving a worthy goal? And what role does government education play in influencing the minds of the youth? To answer these questions, we have to go back to the origins of education. Plato's The Republic is well known for popularizing the concept of mandatory education. But other resources note that Jewish leaders have been requiring parents to provide some form of education for their children since ancient Judea. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Aztec Triple Alliance made education mandatory for boys and girls beginning at age 15. There were at least two known types of schools for the Aztec children: a practical and military-based education, and learning writing, astronomy, theology, and other ideas. In 1496, Scotland established education for all children of privileged elite families. With the enacting of the School Establishment Act of 1616, all children were required to attend school. However, the compulsory school model that gradually spread all over the world was largely based on the Prussian model of education, which was established in 1763. Although Prussian King Frederick William I promoted the concept of compulsory schooling as far back as 1716, education did not become mandatory until 1763, when his son King Frederick the Great ruled that children must attend a state-sponsored school. Under the new ruling, children were required to attend school from their 5th to 13th or 14th year, with fines imposed for not attending. Much has been written about the Prussian model of education. For years, it has been popular to refer to the Prussian model as the industrial or factory model. In more recent years, some educators and historians have pushed back on the idea that the Prussian model was designed to produce obedient workers. So what's the truth? First, it is important to note that the Prussian education model was funded via taxation of the population. Some researchers describe early schools as free public goods, but the reality is that every subject of the Prussian kingdom funded the mandatory schools through taxation.
Let us never forget this fundamental truth. The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves.
The idea that the Prussian system was about maintaining state control over education, and thus the people, was affirmed when King Frederick issued another ruling in 1794. This ruling declared, "Schools and universities are state institutions charged with the instruction of the youth. Schools may be founded only with the knowledge and consent of the state. It is the duty of the school inspectors to see that all children of compulsory school age are kept in school, if necessary by force and by punishment of negligent parents." Horace Mann, sometimes known as the father of American public schooling, was a strong lobbyist for the Prussian schooling design, while still acknowledging that the system had its critics. As he wrote in 1843, numerous tracts were issued from the English press strongly denouncing the whole plan of education in Prussia as being not only designed to produce, but as actually producing, a spirit of blind acquiescence to arbitrary power, in things spiritual as well as temporal, as being, in fine, a system of education adapted to enslave and not to enfranchise the human mind. As the Prussian model solidified, so did international interest in the system. Educational philosophers were intrigued and started lobbying for a similar system across Europe and in the United States. Massachusetts was the first state to institute a mandatory education policy in the United States in 1852. By 1918, every other state had passed similar legislation. It was during this time that seeds were planted which would later grow to become the modern centers known as public schools. Rockefeller education. In the late 19th century, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was one of the wealthiest and most hated men alive. He was the owner of the Standard Oil Company, a monopoly involved in everything associated with the oil industry, from drilling to transportation. It allowed him to accumulate enough wealth to influence many institutions, including America's education system. In 1902, Rockefeller Sr. founded the General Education Board with an initial donation of $1 million. Rockefeller founded the board with help from Frederick T. Gates, with the stated objective to support higher education and medical schools in the United States. The General Education Board was also interested in the promotion of farming in the southern states and schools for African Americans. By January 1903, the U.S. Congress officially incorporated the General Education Board, with their mission being, quote, the promotion of education throughout the United States without distinction as to race, sex, or creed. The General Education Board charter was supported by a bill from Senator Nelson W. Aldrich from Rhode Island. Coincidentally, Senator Aldrich's daughter, Abby Aldrich, was married to John D. Rockefeller Jr. Senator Aldrich would also prove instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Rockefeller family would ultimately give over $180 million to fund the board. The board's founding was preceded by several early educational organizations and private meetings between John D. Rockefeller Jr. and other influential people of the time. One of the men in attendance was Daniel Coit Gilman. Gilman would become a member of the General Education Board and was also the co-founder of the Russell Trust Association, which is the business name for the New Haven, Connecticut-based Skull and Bones Secret Society, which operates a student secret society at Yale University. As we work through this series and explore the pyramid of power, you will notice that certain names and institutions make several appearances. It's important to note how these people and organizations are interwoven. Keep that in mind as we work through this series. After half a decade in existence, the General Education Board ceased operating under that name and was absorbed into the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller family were not the only wealthy tycoons interested in bankrolling educational ventures. In 1905, the infamous steel magnate Andrew Carnegie founded the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Carnegie and Rockefeller were both eager to transform their images from that of rich, out-of-touch robber barons to kind, elderly gentlemen who cared about the poor. To achieve this goal, they created various foundations and philanthropic organizations to spread their vast wealth and influence. The Prussian model of education promoted by the men's organizations was the perfect tool to inculcate the masses with their message of choice, embedding within the structure of public education itself their private ideologies on the appropriate learning material and the structure for the nation's youth. American support and critique of the system grew in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In 1918, Professor Thomas Alexander wrote the following after researching the Prussian model. We believe, however, that a careful study of the Prussian school system will convince any unbiased reader that the Prussian citizen cannot be free to do and act for himself, that the Prussian is to a large measure enslaved through the medium of his school, that his learning, instead of making him his own master, forges the chains by which he is held in servitude, that the whole scheme of Prussian elementary education is shaped with the express purpose of making 95 out of every 100 citizens subservient to the ruling house and to the state. Even more unnerving are the words of Reverend Frederick T. Gates, the business advisor to John D. Rockefeller Sr., who helped him found the General Education Board. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people, or any of their children, into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, and men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. For the task we set before ourselves is very simple, as well as a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life just where they are. The concerns about the Prussian model of education and compulsory education in general continue today.
Charlotte Iserbyt is a freelance writer and former senior policy advisor to the U.S. Department of Education.
In her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, she alleges that changes gradually brought into the American public education system work to eliminate the influences of a child's parents and mold the child into an obedient follower of the state. She believes these changes originated from plans formulated primarily by the Andrew Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Education and the Rockefeller General Education Board. Another critic of the U.S. public school system is John Taylor Gatto, former award-winning New York City school teacher and author of Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling and the Underground History of American Education. Gatto was a vocal opponent to mandatory schooling following his career as a teacher until the time of his death in 2018. Gatto's main thesis is that the school system confuses the students. He says the modern school system presents an incoherent ensemble of information that the child needs to memorize to stay in school rather than teaching critical thinking. Gatto also claimed public schools make children emotionally and intellectually dependent. In Underground History, he says, "What I'm trying to describe is what has happened to our schools was inherent in the original design for a planned economy and a planned society laid down so proudly at the end of the 19th century."
John Taylor Gatto is a former New York City Teacher of the Year and New York State Teacher of the Year. He has a new piece in this month's Harper's, Against School, How Public Education Cripples Our Kids and Why. Mr. Gatto, what's your basic theme here?
Well, my basic theme, I suppose, would be that schools are dangerous places for kids. They retard intellectual development. They retard moral development. They bankrupt communities financially by bleeding hundreds of billions of dollars into unproductive activity, and they bleed communities dynamically by taking the energies of children away from the general society and dissipating them. They're places of intimidation, bullying, sexual harassment, criminality, and even arson and murder, and the epidemic of national obesity can be traced, I think, to the training ground of the school cafeteria.
Okay, there's a lot of ground to cover there. Should schooling be compulsory?
It should not be compulsory.
Gatto also says the design of the public school system makes it clear to students that they cannot hide because they are always supervised.
American forced schooling, because that's what it is, American forced schooling is the design and the execution of corporate foundation. Often the misinformation comes from innocent self-delusion, but just as often as you move up the power pyramid, it comes from a malign intent toward your own individuality.
But are the metal detectors effective in keeping students safe? This is all part of our Generation Under Fire Back to School series. Our Roseanne Aragon spoke with parents, schools, architects, and more about what they think.
Much like an airport, this is the norm for Aldine ISD students. Metal detectors and staff greet intermediate through high school students every morning.
In the age of school drills in preparation for mass shootings, students are increasingly under supervision and inside a prison-like environment. Unfortunately, the dangers of the public school system go beyond attempting to mold the minds of the youth. The public school institutions in America and abroad have been infiltrated by intelligence agencies desperate to recruit the brightest minds of the future. In the book, Spy Schools, How the CIA, FBI, and Foreign Intelligence Secretly Exploit America's Universities, investigative journalist Daniel Golden details the exploitative relationship between higher education and intelligence services, both foreign and domestic.
As I looked into it, it turned out to be quite commonplace.
Golden examines various case studies illustrating how the Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation use higher education to their advantage.
What exactly is involved in this process?
Well, there's different kinds of recruiting, and of course the most innocent, which I have no problem with, where there's just straight overt recruiting on campus, where the CIA and the FBI go in and they hold a career fair or some other event, and they say, come work for the CIA and FBI, and that's fine. And they're only allowed to hire U.S. citizens, so, that's kind of very above board. And then there's an immediate stage where they might want somebody to spy for them, maybe a professor or a researcher whose work takes them regularly overseas, or maybe somebody who's in communication with foreign scientists, and they have a cutting-edge specialty, and they say, can you provide us information? And again, that's a little more dicey, but at least they're saying they're the CIA, and they're explaining what they want to do. And then the third kind, which I focus on the most, is when they deal with foreign students and, researchers and professors. And there, if the person is not a U.S. citizen, they're not obliged to disclose who they are. So the CIA might well approach somebody who's unwitting. They might have a professor who they're friendly with, has a graduate student from Iran or China, and the professor might say to the student, I've got a friend who'd like to pay you to do some work for him or something, and then not say that the friend is from the CIA. So that's one way.
When you understand all the data we have just uncovered, it becomes clear that the compulsory public education system is a great tool for influencing, manipulating, and recruiting the minds of the youth. Even if we ignore the obvious influence of the militaristic Prussian model, it is plain to see that the foundations and institutions which fund public education are aware of the opportunity to inject their agendas and values into higher learning. Not only are children sent away from their parents and families for 8 hours a day for 12 or more years of their lives, but it happens at a time in their lives when they are often the most impressionable and trusting of the adults around them. While it is true that occasionally a student will encounter a great teacher who encourages individuality and critical thinking, the average teacher is simply parodying the curriculum which the state has approved. If the ambitious teacher dares stray away from the pre-approved content, they may find themselves punished or out of a job altogether. Finally, it's important to note that when children and young adults are subjected to the state's version of history, health, politics, and philosophy, limitations are often subconsciously and covertly placed on their minds. The youth is taught the state's version of history, which typically paints the current powers as the good guys in conflict, establishes the approved version of history, healthcare, and creates parameters for acceptable political and philosophical dialogue. So what can we do about it? The answer is to break free from this centralized, state-mandated model of education. The beauty of the digital age is that it has broadened the opportunities for learning. Not only is the internet itself available as a resource for the intrepid and determined student, but dozens of online education websites have launched in recent years. Rather than depending on the government for education or putting yourself in thousands of dollars of debt to obtain a piece of paper, the youth of today have abundant resources for education. There are free and paid websites for grade school education, both religious and secular, and there are free and paid websites offering college courses. There are literally thousands of online schools which offer courses in continued learning. While it's not always feasible or affordable for parents to take their young children out of school, there is a growing movement of parents who are homeschooling or even unschooling their children. These movements differ and overlap, but the point is that some parents have had enough with the mainstream education options and are removing their children altogether. These parents seek to provide an education for their children while not subjecting them to state propaganda.
Some parents are even partnering with each other to form education pods where they can network and share information on alternative education.
These pods are similar to one of the solutions we will be promoting throughout this series, known as Freedom Cells. Freedom Cells are a decentralized manner of organizing in groups of 8 to promote skills, knowledge, and resources. The concept can easily be applied to groups of parents or even students who are looking to empower themselves individually and as a group. Imagine a Freedom Cell, or pod, focused on educating their children outside of the state-run education system. This independence and decentralization could help free the youth from education systems designed to limit their potential. The minds of the youth are one of the most valuable resources available on this planet. The heads of state and philanthropists have recognized this for centuries. Protecting and compassionately guiding these minds is of utmost importance. If parents and mentors do not take an active role in contributing towards the education of the youth, it is only a matter of time before other influences joyfully take the opportunity. 99 students out of 100 are automata, careful to walk in prescribed paths, careful to follow the prescribed custom. This is not an accident, but the result of substantial education, which scientifically defined is the subsummation of the individual. To learn more about the Prussian model of education and the history of education, we encourage you to read the following books: The Prussian Elementary Schools by Thomas Alexander, Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, and The Underground History of American Education by John Taylor Gatto, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America by Charlotte Iserbyt, Spy Schools, How the CIA, FBI, and Foreign Intelligence Secretly Exploit America's Universities by Daniel Golden. We also encourage you to watch the Tragedy and Hope interview series with John Taylor Gatto. Chapter 2: Establishment Media. For many of us, one of the first things we do in the morning is check out our favorite news stations, newspapers, social media feeds, and websites to get informed on the important events of the day. People of all political persuasions have a desire to be informed about the world around them and the topics they care about. The average person might believe that the hundreds of TV stations, millions of websites, and never-ending social media feeds offer a limitless resource of factual, credible information that will keep them up to date about the important issues. However, as with the education system, there are many concerns related to mass media and the numerous conflicts of interest. First, let's start by looking at the history of media ownership in the United States and around the world. In the early 1980s, about 50 corporations controlled most of American media, including magazines, books, music, newspapers, movie studios, radio, and TV stations. Within a decade, that number would drop to around 25, and by the year 2000, just 6 corporations had control of about 90% of the media. As of 2020, that number is down to 5 corporations. These corporations include AT&T, Disney, Comcast, Fox Corp, and National Amusements. Many of the previous large media corporations have been purchased by or merged with one of these top 5. Comcast owns NBC, Telemundo, MSNBC, CNBC, USA Network, Sci-Fi, Oxygen, Bravo, the film studio Universal Pictures, multiple animation studios, and Universal Parks and Resorts. Disney owns Walt Disney Studios, which includes Pixar, Marvel Studios, Lucasfilm, and 20th Century Studios. Disney also owns ESPN and ABC News and Networks. Fox Corp owns Fox, Fox News Channel, Fox Business, Fox Sports, while National Amusements owns Viacom CBS, which owns Paramount Pictures, CBS Entertainment Network, Nickelodeon, BET, MTV, Comedy Central, and various international networks. AT&T is the world's largest media and entertainment company in terms of revenue. The megacorporation owns the Warner Media Group, which has film, TV, and cable assets, including Warner Brothers, HBO, Cartoon Network, Adult Swim, TBS, TNT, and True TV. Internationally, large media conglomerates include Bertelsmann, National Amusements, Sony Corporation, Hearst Communications, MGM Holdings Incorporated, and Grupo Globo in South America. There are also major news organizations not owned by the Big Five. The New York Times is owned by the publicly held New York Times Corporation. The Washington Post is owned by Nash Holdings, an LLC owned by Amazon's Jeff Bezos. The Hearst family-owned Hearst Publications owns 24 newspapers, including the San Francisco Chronicle and Houston Chronicle, as well as magazines, TV stations, and cable and interactive media. Rupert Murdoch is the executive co-chairman of Fox Corporation and is also chairman of News Corp, which owns the Wall Street Journal and other publications. Altogether, his family controls 120 newspapers across 5 countries. Billionaire Michael Bloomberg is also a longtime media mogul with Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Media. Donald Newhouse and his brother Samuel Newhouse inherited Advanced Publications, a privately held media company that controls newspapers, magazine, cable TV, and entertainment assets including Discovery Channel, Reddit, and Condé Nast, which publishes magazines Wired, Vanity Fair, GQ, The New Yorker, and Vogue. Several other billionaires, including Comcast CEO Brian Roberts and Liberty Media Chairman John Malone, own or control cable TV networks that are powerful but not primarily news-focused. One clear example of how funding by billionaires and megacorporations can create a conflict of interest came in 2016 when the New York Times published an article criticizing the power that billionaires wield over media companies. One ultra-wealthy media investor was not mentioned in the story: Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim. At the time, Slim owned the largest individual stake at the Times, but was not mentioned. Slim sold half of his stocks in 2017, but still remains the second largest shareholder. While there is no clear evidence that Slim played any role in the omission of his ownership of the Times, it does illustrate the difficulty the average reader faces in assessing who is trying to influence their worldview. It's clear that the consolidation of the media presents an opportunity for the corporations, shareholders, families, and individuals behind the media to influence and shape public opinion. This is one of the reasons the media has often been called the Fourth Estate, a phrase derived from the traditional European concept of the three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. The Fourth Estate represents a fourth power in press and news media which have the capacity to advocate for and frame political issues. In the 1988 book Manufacturing Consent, noted intellectual and linguist Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman argue that the mass media of the US are effective and powerful institutions which use system-supportive propaganda to influence the public without the use of coercion. They call this the propaganda model of communication.
For many people, the idea that propaganda is used by democratic rather than merely authoritarian governments will be a strange one.
Well, the term propaganda fell into disfavor around the Second World War, but in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was commonly used and, in fact, advocated not by leading intellectuals, by the founders of modern political science, by Wilsonian progressives, and, of course, by the public relations industry, as a necessary technique to overcome the danger of democracy. The institutional structure of the media is quite straightforward. We're talking about the United States, but it's not very different elsewhere. There are sectors, but the agenda-setting media, the ones that sort of set the framework for everyone else, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, these are major corporations, parts of even bigger conglomerates. Like other corporate institutions, they have a product and a market. Their market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. Their product is relatively privileged audiences, more or less.
So they're selling audiences to
They're selling privileged audiences. These are big corporations selling privileged audiences to other corporations. Now the question is, what picture of the world would a rational person expect to come out of this structure? And then we draw some conclusions about what you'd expect, and then we check, and yes, that's the picture of the world that comes out.
In the 2002 introduction to the book, they write, quote, "The media serve and propagandize on behalf of the powerful societal interests that control and finance them. The representatives of these interests have important agendas and principles that they want to advance, and they are well positioned to shape and constrain media policy." Chomsky has gone on to describe various methods the media uses to influence public opinion, including by distraction, gradualism, deferring actions until a later date that the public might be more accepting, talking to the public like children, stirring up viewers' emotions, keeping the public ignorant, promoting trends, blaming the public for problems, and by understanding the underlying psychology of the masses. Ben Bagdikian, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, describes the 5 media giants as a cartel that wields enough influence to change US politics and define social values. Quote, "The Ford Motor Company and General Motors do not compete to the death because each has too much to lose in an all-or-nothing rivalry. Similarly, the major media maintains their cartel-like relationships with only marginal differences among them, a relationship that leaves all of them alive and well, but leaves the majority of Americans with artificially narrowed choices in their media." Ruling class journalism. As early as 1973, reports started to reveal that the US intelligence community was infiltrating foreign and domestic media. In late November of that year, the New York Times reported that the CIA had about 36 American journalists working abroad on its payroll as undercover informants, some of them as full-time agents. None of the names of the journalists were revealed to the public. In 1975, the US Senate organized the US Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, otherwise known as the Church Committee, named after Idaho Senator Frank Church, who chaired the committee. Church and his team were tasked with investigating abuses by the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and the Internal Revenue Service. The Church Committee investigations are well known for revealing many illegal activities by the intelligence community, including the discovery of Operation Shamrock, in which the major telecommunications companies shared their traffic with the NSA from 1945 to the early 1970s. There was also discussion about a poison dart program that could cause someone to have a heart attack. And of course, there were the infamous MKUltra documents, which revealed the CIA's efforts to manipulate and control the human mind. The Church Committee's final report, published in April 1976, also covered CIA ties with both foreign and domestic news media. The report mentions that agents had planted false stories about activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. The report found that the CIA maintained a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempted to influence public opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provided the CIA with direct access to many newspapers and periodicals, press services and news agencies, radio and TV stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets. In the United States, the CIA estimated they had around 50 assets who are individual American journalists or employees of US media organizations. The committee found that more than a dozen US news organizations and commercial publishing houses formerly provided cover for the CIA agents abroad. At a House Intelligence Committee hearing in 1975, CIA Director William Colby was questioned about whether the agency had employees in TV networks and newspapers.
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals. Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks? This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
In 1976, a New York Times article titled CIA Ties to Journalists reported that, quote, a draft copy of a report by the House Select Committee on Intelligence last week said that 11 full-time officers of the CIA were posing as journalists overseas in connection with their intelligence work. The report said further that until 1978, live agents had posed as full-time correspondents with organizations that have major general news impact. Moreover, the report said some 15 news organizations had cooperated with the CIA in providing cover for CIA operatives. The Times goes on to state that press freedom here is protected from government intrusion under the First Amendment to the Constitution, and thus a reader, viewer, or listener has the right to expect that the news will not be slanted to conform to a governmental position. An agent reporting from abroad to the United States would face an impossible task in sorting out his allegiance to his real employer, the CIA, from that to his news organization and its readers. The CIA formally refused to make public the names of which American news agencies cooperated with the CIA, which ones allowed themselves to be used as cover, and the names of the reporters who secretly worked for the CIA. The Times also noted that Sam Jaff, a former TV reporter who admitted to working with the FBI, accused popular journalists like Walter Cronkite of CBS of being on the list of journalists paid by the CIA. Despite the fact that the US government never actually used the name, the CIA's manipulation of mainstream media has come to be known as Operation Mockingbird.
First of all, it is important to note that what we know of as Operation Mockingbird was not called Operation Mockingbird, or at least there is absolutely no reason to believe that. The entire idea that this program to infiltrate the media was called Operation Mockingbird actually sources to a single offhand mention in one book by Deborah Davis about Catherine Graham that was sourced to an unnamed anonymous CIA person, so take it for what it's worth. Having said that, the CIA absolutely did engage, and presumably still does, but admittedly did engage in an extensive operation to infiltrate the media at all levels, less controversially internationally, by setting up publishing houses, by having journalists and reporters stationed overseas, by various methods for controlling what was seen overseas, but that, at least theoretically, is within the CIA's mandate to operate internationally. More controversially, it absolutely did the same things domestically within the United States, directly against the CIA's charter to operate only internationally, and we do not have to go on a speculative limb for that. It was admitted during the Church Committee hearings by the CIA that they did have agents in the American media that would, at the very least, forward stories to American media for publication. But subsequent reporting on that by Carl Bernstein in his seminal 1977 work for Rolling Stones, The CIA and the Media, he absolutely showed from a number of different sources that there were not only journalists who were reporting and acting essentially as informants for the CIA, there were actual agents that were undercover as journalists and reporters. The CIA had extensive ties to editors and extensive ties to publishers like the family behind the New York Times. And other reporting has shown that, for example, Allen Dulles in the early days of the CIA could and did often call up publishers in the US in order to change certain stories or to get certain facts reported or not reported.
Carl Bernstein's 1977 Rolling Stone article, The CIA and the Media, reported that the relationship between the intelligence community and the mainstream media was much more extensive than even the Church Committee revealed.
The CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country.
Bernstein alleged that the committee actually helped cover up some of the worst aspects of the partnership because it would have revealed, quote, embarrassing relationships in the 1950s and 1960s with some of the most powerful organizations and individuals in American journalism. Bernstein reported that from 1950 to 1966, about 10 CIA employees were provided cover by the New York Times under arrangements approved by the newspaper's late publisher Arthur Hayes Sulzberger. The cover arrangements were part of a general Times policy to provide assistance to the CIA whenever possible. In addition, Sulzberger was a close friend of CIA Director Allen Dulles. Bernstein's reporting also showed that during the 1950s, the CIA conducted a formal training program to instruct its agents to function as newsmen. Quote, these were the guys who went through the ranks and were told, you're going to be a journalist, one CIA official told Bernstein. Bernstein also reported that the CIA's former director Allen Dulles and close friend Henry Luce, the founder of Time and Life magazine, regularly allowed members of his staff to work for the CIA. Several other revelations came out in 1977, including Sig Mickelson, former head of CBS, admitting that he had often worked with the intelligence community in the 1950s.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
Additionally, the Times reported that, quote, dozens of English and foreign language publications around the world have been owned, subsidized, or influenced in some way by the CIA over the past 3 decades as part of a global propaganda network maintained by the agency. Perhaps even more damaging, William Colby admitted that some American networks had unwittingly repeated false stories planted by the CIA. The CIA claimed the practice of using journalists to distribute stories had ended in 1973. However, in July 1996, the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence held a hearing regarding public policy on the CIA's possible use of journalists, clergy, or Peace Corps. The director of the CIA at the time, John Deutsch, wanted to change regulations prohibiting the use of journalists, clergy, and missionaries, and the Peace Corps abroad to perform political intelligence operations. A New York Times article from February 1996 notes that Deutsch was questioned about reports that the CIA had secretly waived 1977 regulations in extraordinarily rare occasions and used journalistic or media cover for intelligence activities overseas. CIA officials declined to acknowledge whether members of church leadership have been used as CIA assets as well. Interestingly, the Times article notes that the controversy over the CIA's use of non-diplomatic covers came after recommendations by a task force sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations. The task force called for ending legal and policy restraints that limit the CIA's use of such non-diplomatic covers as journalists and members of clergy. The reason this connection is interesting is because only 3 years earlier, in 1993, Richard Harwood, journalist and former editor of the Washington Post, wrote a powerful article titled Ruling Class Journalists, in which he outlines how the American corporate mainstream media serves the agenda of the ruling class. Harwood doesn't focus his column on the US intelligence agencies, which are using the media to spread various types of propaganda. Instead, Harwood discusses the connection between the American media and the Council on Foreign Relations. Harwood writes, quote, in its 70-year history, the quarterly journal, Foreign Affairs, has had but 5 editors. The 5th, recently appointed, is James Hogue, former publisher of the New York Daily News, and before that, editor of the Chicago Sun-Times. The quarterly is published by the Council on Foreign Relations, whose members are the nearest thing we have to a ruling establishment in the United States. The President is a member, so is his Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, all 5 of the Undersecretaries, several of the Assistant Secretaries, and the Department's legal advisor. The President's National Security Advisor and his deputy are members. The Director of Central Intelligence, like all previous directors, and the Chairman of the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board are members. Harwood goes on to note that many leading figures of American political life were members of the Council on Foreign Relations, including Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Cyrus Vance, McGeorge Bundy, Governor Mario Cuomo, and so on. In later chapters of this series, we will return to the topic of the Council on Foreign Relations and how non-governmental organizations, think tanks, and nonprofits also play a role in the pyramid of power. The point is that the media around the world are not only influenced by corporate dollars and interests, but they are often a tool for disseminating intelligence community propaganda and promoting the agenda of the ruling class. Despite the promises of ending collaboration between spy agencies and journalists, as recently as 2014, the CIA was caught collaborating with the journalist from the LA Times. The rise of independent media. Due to the consistent failures of the corporate media and the glaring bias, the public has developed a thirst for unfiltered, honest reporting that is not often found on TV and radio networks. The internet helped accelerate the rise of an independent or alternative media where citizen journalists, activists, self-taught reporters, and social media commentators compete directly with the corporate media. The internet also saw the launch of hundreds of thousands of new websites that do not fit into the traditional media hierarchy. In the mid-2000s, with the emergence of YouTube and other popular social media networks, the alternative media was able to outpace the mainstream media and reach the masses at an unprecedented rate. By the 2010s, a growing ecosystem of alternative media websites, channels, podcasts, and reporters began to materialize. Some outlets eschewed the glitz and glamour of the corporate media in favor of reports broadcast in living rooms and from the streets. Other outlets aimed to recreate the professionalism of the mainstream while retaining a willingness to question all angles. Unfortunately, the decentralized nature of the internet has been forsaken in favor of centralized institutions which offer search engines, social media, and other internet services. The vast majority of the public use Google, Facebook, and YouTube to learn about the world around them. These folks mistakenly assume that they are seeing everything that is available on the internet. As we will detail in our upcoming chapter on big tech, this is far from true. After the 2016 US presidential election, many independent outlets and journalists from across the political spectrum faced another attack in the form of the fake news movement.
You are fake news.
First popularized by Donald Trump, the fake news label was quickly used to attack any outlets that did not parrot the mainstream version of events surrounding the 2016 election. One by one, independent media websites and pages were labeled fake news or Russian disinformation, and subsequently deleted from various social media platforms. Since that time, the social media landscape has shifted even further with the use of corporate fact-checkers and banning of certain topics altogether. Another way the pyramid of power maintains influence is through purchasing and/or funding of so-called new media companies which attempt to portray themselves as independent and are typically marketed towards a younger audience. Despite the slick presentation and the use of a younger, diverse crowd as reporters, these companies are merely a rebranding of the same propaganda distributed by the billionaires, corporations, and intelligence agencies. Some of these companies include Vice Media, Vox Media, and BuzzFeed. The intelligence agencies' attempt to manipulate and influence public opinion goes beyond hiring journalists. According to one of the documents leaked by Edward Snowden, the British government maintains software for online persona management. The British Government Communications Headquarters, the GCHQ, operates an elite unit known as the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group, or JTRIG. The documents outline tactics employed by the agency, including ways to manipulate public opinion, understand human thinking and behavior, and encourage conformity. One of the reports from 2011 outlines JTRIG's tactics, including uploading YouTube videos containing persuasive communications, starting Facebook groups and Twitter accounts, and creating fake online personalities and supporters to discredit, promote distrust, dissuade, deter, delay, or disrupt. The unit uses social media campaigns to encourage and foster obedience and conformity. Both the British intelligence and the US intelligence community desire to promote obedience and conformity within the public. They aim to keep the public propagandized, distracted, misinformed, and fighting amongst ourselves. The billionaires use their media outlets and their friends in government to keep the public blissfully unaware of their efforts to gain power and wealth. Thankfully, there are solutions. Even with the censorship and outright deleting of alternative media journalists and outlets, there are some solutions available. For starters, more and more mainstream journalists are opting to leave behind the corporate world and join the independent media in the interest of reporting factual, investigative journalism. The last decade has seen Amber Lyon leave CNN, Cheryl Atkinson leave CBS, Glenn Greenwald leave The Guardian for The Intercept, and then leave The Intercept to go completely independent. Another mainstream journalist turned independent reporter is Ben Swann, a former anchor for CBS Atlanta who left after facing censorship for his reporting. I recently spoke with Ben Swann about what he sees as the failures of the mainstream media, including the idea that journalists cannot have opinions.
Well, the idea that journalists don't have opinions is absolutely false, right? And that's obvious. It's obvious. Human nature says every human is going to have opinions on things. Actually, this is a kind of a misleading concept that's been pushed by companies like CNN for a long time. It's what Glenn Greenwald calls the view to nowhere, right? Which is, I'm the subjective journalist, I don't have an opinion, I don't know anything, I just report what I see. But that's a robot, right? That's not a person. And so what is a more honest way of handling it is to say, you know what, I do have an opinion, and if I'm upfront about my opinions, so obviously I'm very libertarian in my views, I believe in individual freedom, individual liberties, I'm very upfront about that, so you know where I'm coming from. However, it's not important whether or not you have an opinion. It's important whether or not you take the facts of a story and you twist them to meet your opinion, or you twist them to fit what you already have as a preconceived notion. I believe that as journalists, that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is saying we'll go wherever the facts lead us in a story, but obviously we're going to have opinions on things.
Swann and other former mainstream journalists have not only abandoned traditional media outlets. Many have begun using alternative social media platforms and websites to broadcast their video reports and articles. Glenn Greenwald and journalist Matt Taibbi have begun using independent service Substack to publish their reports, while Swann has launched his own video service, ice.media, to report freely without being censored by social media companies and search engines.
Pushback against the social purge taking place on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Google.
Additionally, there are a number of alternative social media sites and video hosting platforms that have begun to offer a censorship-free experience for those who desire an unfiltered social media and news platform. Sites like BitChute, Library, Minds, Float, and Hive offer content creators options for overcoming the mainstream media dominance. As consumers of the media, we have the opportunity to support websites and platforms that provide fair coverage of important events. As Ben Swann noted, this doesn't mean news media that has no opinion or bias. Rather, it's the expectation that the media will trust the viewer to consume content from a wide range of opinions and views and make up their own mind. The answer is for each of us to make a conscious decision to unplug from state-run propaganda networks and online platforms that attempt to make up your mind for you. The answer is to support independent media organizations and journalists who do the vital work of dissecting the world around us and presenting the facts to the public. Only by consciously choosing to support true independent media that is not funded by billionaires, corporations, and spy agencies can we possibly hope to preserve a free media that will empower and educate the public. To learn more about the control and manipulation of the media, we recommend reading Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing of Consent and Ben Bakdickian's The New Media Monopoly. Chapter 3: Big Tech. By now, most viewers will be familiar with the well-publicized problems of social media. It's purposefully addictive, produces jealousy, insecurity, and depression in some people, and the big socials sell your data for a profit. Despite the growing awareness of these problems, companies like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube are still some of the most widely used platforms in the world. Billions of people download these apps and use them to stay informed about the world, or so they believe. While these issues are absolutely worrisome, they are not the only issues we should be concerned about. To understand the role social media plays in the pyramid of power, we need to understand the origins of social media. More specifically, we need to understand the origins of the big tech giants behind social media. The big tech companies are the largest and most dominant companies in the information technology industry of the United States, namely Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. Alternatively, there are other labels such as FANG, which refers to the 5 prominent American tech companies: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, or Alphabet Inc., Google's parent company. The point is that these companies dominate information technology in most of the world and shape the direction of the various markets they operate in. Amazon dominates the e-commerce online sales market, as well as AI smart assistants and smart speakers. Apple and Google share a monopoly on cell phones. Google, of course, claims the title of leading online search engine for most of the world, as well as top video sharing with YouTube and top online mapping and navigation with Google Maps. Microsoft dominates the operating systems market, shares the cloud computing market with Amazon, and is highly influential in the video game industry via their Xbox system. Facebook is known for being one of the top 3 companies in digital advertising, which they gain through their social networks. They also dominate image sharing with Instagram and messaging with WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. In fact, big tech's growth in wealth and influence over the last decade has surpassed the wealth and influence of the big media companies we covered in Chapter 2. So where did these companies come from, and are they influencing our world for ill or for good? The basic narrative, we are told, is that the big tech companies were started by brilliant men, mostly in California, in the area now commonly known as Silicon Valley. Through their hard work and determination, these companies were able to rise from the garages and college dorms to become the giants we know them as today. There's just one problem. This version of events is cartoonish at best and an outright deception at worst. It's important to understand that nearly every big tech tool you use today was funded, in part, by the US intelligence community and supported in various ways by the US government itself. The rise of the big tech companies is not a fairy tale of free market success, but rather a dark and disturbing story of corporate welfare and deep ties to the intelligence community. In fact, most of the digital tools you use, including cell phones, GPS, and the internet itself, started out as tools for the military. These tools were designed by the US Department of Defense under the direction of the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, the Big Tech Intelligence Complex. What we know as the internet, or the World Wide Web, was first developed by the military as the ARPANET. One of the best sources for the true origins of big tech is the book Surveillance Valley by researcher Yasha Levine. In his groundbreaking book, Levine outlines the role that the military and intelligence apparatus played in advancing these tools from being used exclusively by the military to being used by millions of people around the world.
Back then, people understood what this technology was about. Going back to as early as 1969, which is the first year that the ARPANET was turned on. So the ARPANET was turned on in 1969. That same year, there was huge protest in MIT against the ARPANET. And there were these pamphlets and booklets passed out on campus talking about the ARPANET as the beginning of this surveillance network that was going to allow what they called Washington's policemen to better manage the world and to control the world. And so it was obvious to people almost half a century ago what this network was, and we've sort of lost it. It had been really successfully rebranded starting in the 1980s and 1990s into something utopian, whereas it wasn't that before.
In 2017, a former director of the National Science Foundation shed more light when he published an article exploring the true founding of Google. Quote, "The research arms of the CIA and NSA hoped that the best computer science minds in academia could identify what they called birds of a feather. Just as geese fly together in large V-shapes or flocks of sparrows make sudden movements together in harmony, they predicted that like-minded groups of humans would move together online. Their research aim was to track digital fingerprints inside the rapidly expanding global information network, which was then known as the World Wide Web. Could an entire world of digital information be organized so that requests humans made inside such a network might be tracked and sorted? Could their queries be linked and ranked in order of importance? Could birds of a feather be identified inside this sea of information so that communities and groups could be tracked in an organized way?" Jeff Nesbitt goes on to describe how Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the ostensible founders of Google, were originally funded through, quote, "through an unclassified, highly compartmentalized program that was managed for the CIA and the NSA by large military and intelligence contractors. It was called the Massive Digital Data Systems Project. Eventually, the research by Brin and Page under these grants became the heart of Google's search engine." Nesbitt writes, quote, "The intelligence community, however, saw a slightly different benefit in their research. Could the network be organized so efficiently that individual users could be uniquely identified and tracked? In 2014, more details emerged regarding the relationship between Sergey Brin, former Google executive Eric Schmidt, and the National Security Agency. A Freedom of Information Act request revealed that Brin and Schmidt were on a first-name basis with then NSA Chief General Keith Alexander. Additionally, Google was part of a, quote, secretive government initiative known as the Enduring Security Framework, and this initiative involved Silicon Valley partnering with the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence community to share information at network speed. The connections between Google and the intelligence firms that have spent decades spying on the public, infiltrating the public school system, and establishment media also involve the CIA's venture capital firm, In-Q-Tel. For example, we know that the software that would become Google Earth was born out of technology originally developed by the company Keyhole Incorporated, which itself had a close relationship with the US intelligence community. However, Google was not the only big tech firm who maintained a relationship with In-Q-Tel. Facebook executives also had close ties to CIA venture capital firm In-Q-Tel. Journalist James Corbett reports.
Publicly, In-Q-Tel markets itself as an innovative way to leverage the power of the private sector by identifying key emerging technologies and providing companies with the funding to bring those technologies to market. In reality, however, what In-Q-Tel represents is a dangerous blurring of the lines between the public and private sectors in a way that makes it difficult to tell where the American intelligence community ends and the IT sector begins.
Two of the names that come up most often in connection with In-Q-Tel, however, need no introduction: Google and Facebook. The publicly available record on the Facebook In-Q-Tel connection is tenuous. Facebook received $12.7 million in venture capital from Excel, whose manager, James Breyer, now sits on their board. He was formerly the chairman of the National Venture Capital Association, whose board included Gilman Louie, then the CEO of In-Q-Tel. The connection is indirect, but the suggestion of CIA involvement with Facebook, however tangential, is disturbing in the light of Facebook's history of violating the privacy of its users.
Around the time Facebook was launched, a similarly themed government project was coming to an end. LifeLog was a project of the Information Processing Techniques Office of DARPA, designed, quote, to be able to trace the threads of an individual's life in terms of events, states, and relationships, with the ability to take in all of a subject's experiences from phone numbers dialed and email messages viewed to every breath taken, steps made, and place gone. USA Today reported that, quote, cameras and microphones would capture what the user sees or hears. Sensors would record what he or she feels. Global positioning satellites would log every movement. Biomedical sensors would monitor vital signs. Emails, instant messages, web-based transactions, telephone calls, and voicemails would all be stored. Mail and faxes would be scanned. Links to every radio and television broadcast heard and every newspaper, magazine, book, website, or database seen would be recorded. DARPA contractors stated that LifeLog software, quote, will be able to find meaningful patterns in the timetable to infer the user's routines, habits, and relationships with other people, organizations, places, and objects. Ultimately, the program was abandoned because of surveillance fears. On February 4, 2004, Wired magazine reported that the Pentagon was abandoning the LifeLog project. Ironically, this is the exact day that Mark Zuckerberg launched his first iteration of Facebook. LifeLog's creator Douglas Gage recently told Motherboard he feels that in many ways, Facebook has accomplished the goals of LifeLog. Quote, I think that Facebook is the real face of pseudo-LifeLog at this point. I generally avoid using Facebook, only occasionally logging in to see what everyone is up to, and I have never liked anything. Another important note regarding social media and intelligence agencies relates to the 2013 revelations by Edward Snowden. According to one of the documents leaked by Edward Snowden, the British government maintains software for online persona management. The British government communications headquarters operates an elite unit known as the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group. The documents outline tactics employed by the agency, including ways to manipulate public opinion, understand human thinking and behavior, and encourage conformity. One of the reports from 2011 outlines J-Trig's tactics, including uploading YouTube videos containing persuasive communications, starting Facebook groups and Twitter accounts, and creating fake online personalities and supporters to, quote, discredit, promote distrust, dissuade, deter, delay, or disrupt. The unit used social media campaigns to encourage and foster obedience and conformity. The British intelligence and the US intelligence community both desire to promote obedience and conformity within the public. They use social media to keep the public propagandized, distracted, misinformed, and fighting amongst themselves. We could go on to detail the intelligence connections and partnerships between Facebook, Apple, Google, and Amazon, but the point is that the origins of the big tech firms which control information technology are much different from what is promoted in the mainstream. These companies have directly and indirectly benefited from the financial investments of the US military and intelligence sectors. They have also shown a willingness to share user data with law enforcement. These big tech firms are also furthering the all-pervasive surveillance state. Not only are Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon tracking your habits on and offline, they are profiting from that knowledge. With the growth of AI smart assistants and speakers like Amazon Echo, Google's Nest, Apple's Siri, and other devices, millions of people around the world are welcoming the surveillance state into their homes. Amazon is well known for their online marketplace, but less people are aware that the big tech firm has been developing facial recognition software called Rekognition. Amazon has marketed the facial recognition tools to police departments in the United States, claiming that the software will allow real-time surveillance using body cameras. In 2018, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the American Civil Liberties Union, Human Rights Watch, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and nearly 40 other organizations filed a lawsuit demanding that Amazon cease providing law enforcement access to surveillance technology. The EFF stated, "Amazon has been heavily marketing this tool, called Rekognition, to law enforcement, and it's already being used by agencies in Florida and Oregon. This system affords the government vast and dangerous surveillance powers, and it poses a threat to the privacy and freedom of communities across the country. That includes many of Amazon's own customers, who represent more than 75% of US online consumers." In 2020, Amazon was reportedly talking with the police department from Jackson, Mississippi, to connect their Ring doorbell cameras to a 24-hour surveillance center operated by the police. The Jackson Police Surveillance Center would conduct a 45-day pilot program to live stream the security cameras of participating residents, including a direct line to residents' Amazon Ring doorbell cameras. By June 2020, Amazon announced it was implementing a one-year moratorium on police use of Rekognition in response to the George Floyd protests. However, in February 2021, documents revealed that the Los Angeles Police Department had already used the Ring doorbell cameras to monitor activists. The big tech military-industrial complex. In 2020, the public became aware of the true power wielded by the big tech companies that run the popular social media platforms. Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Google, and Amazon all sought to downrank, shadow ban, delete, and/or ban information that went against the accepted narratives for COVID-19, the 2020 election, and basically any other topic deemed controversial. While many people chose to frame this attack on free expression as an attack on conservatives or the right wing, the reality is that prominent left-wing pages and channels also suffered the same fate because they also committed the cardinal sin of social media, asking questions and making claims not accepted by the so-called authorities. In short, if you ask too many questions and did not parrot the mainstream right or left-wing positions, it's highly likely you will find yourself demonetized or banned altogether. Some folks incorrectly argue that big tech is made up of private companies which have the freedom to decide what goes on their platforms. This argument ignores the wealth of evidence indicating the close relationship between big tech and US intelligence, as well as the seed funding received by many of the companies. Essentially, these companies would not be as monolithic as they are without the support of the government. They are hardly a representation of free market economics. Which brings us to the final point. These big tech firms often serve the purpose of reinforcing a particular narrative that is beneficial to the US government and intelligence community. It's no mistake that the pages and channels which have been removed have often been those which expose the US war machine, the violence of police, and overall, the lies of the US government. Although most of the public was unaware, the attacks on independent journalism and free voices began in earnest immediately after the election of Donald Trump in November 2016. The media began promoting story after story, claiming that government insiders had evidence that the Russians interfered with the US elections by propagating fake news stories that favored Trump and attacked Hillary Clinton. The Washington Post and other mouthpieces for the establishment ran with a report from the organization Prop or Not, which claimed to identify websites that were spreading fake news and possibly working as Russian propagandists. The list contained many well-known American alternative media sites, including Activist Post, Mint Press News, the Free Thought Project, and the Anti-Media. Although Trump popularized the fake news meme, It was very quickly used to demonize alternative and independent media who did not fall in line with the Russian narrative. The rise of the fake news meme had immediate repercussions for the alternative media. Many sites lost access to Google Ads for revenue generation, others were shadow banned on Facebook and Twitter, while others were cut off from payment processors like PayPal and Patreon. The relationship between the military-industrial complex and Facebook was made even more clear in May 2018 when Facebook announced a new partnership with the Atlantic Council, a think tank which officially claims to provide a forum for international political, business, and intellectual leaders. The social media giant said the partnership was aimed at preventing Facebook from, quote, being abused during elections. The press release promoted Facebook's effort to fight fake news by using artificial intelligence, as well as working with outside experts and governments. The Atlantic Council of the United States was established in 1961 to bolster support for international relations. Although not officially connected to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the Atlantic Council has spent decades promoting causes and issues which are beneficial to NATO member states. In addition, the Atlantic Council is a member of the Atlantic Treaty Association, an umbrella organization which acts as a network facilitator in the Euro-Atlantic and beyond. The ATA works similarly to the Atlantic Council, bringing together political leaders, academics, military officials, journalists, and diplomats to promote values that are favorable to the NATO member states. Officially, ATA is independent of NATO, but the line between the two is razor thin. Essentially, the Atlantic Council is a think tank which can offer companies or nation states access to military officials, politicians, journalists, and diplomats to help them develop a plan to implement their strategy or vision. These strategies often involve getting NATO governments or industry insiders to make decisions they might not have made without a visit from the Atlantic Council team. This allows individuals or nations to push forth their ideas under the cover of hiring what appears to be a public relations agency, but what is actually selling access to high-profile individuals with power to affect public policy. Everyone from George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton have spoken at or attended council events. Clearly, despite what Facebook says, this partnership will further align the goals of Facebook with the Western military-industrial complex. This was made evident in October 2018 when Facebook announced that they were unpublishing or purging over 500 pages and 200 accounts who were accused of spreading political spam. Several of these pages and writers were also removed from Twitter on the same day. In a blog post, Facebook wrote, "Today we're removing 559 pages and 251 accounts that have consistently broken our rules against spam and coordinated inauthentic behavior." Facebook states that the people behind this alleged spam, quote, create networks of pages using fake accounts or multiple accounts with the same name and post the same clickbait posts in dozens of Facebook groups. This action by Facebook became known as the Purge of 2018 and was only the first of many to come. With Facebook and other big tech firms developing a revolving door relationship between the military-industrial complex, it's highly likely that anti-establishment voices will continue to be stifled. Now that we understand the big tech firms are cartels of information technology with deep ties to the US intelligence community and military who sell their users' data and manipulate their emotions, it's time to figure out what we are going to do about these problems. Solutions. Better tech. The solutions for dealing with big tech are deceptively simple. Boycott them. It's as simple and difficult as that. If we each consciously choose to deny Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft our data and our money, we can limit the ways they affect our lives. So what does boycotting big tech look like? Let's start with social media. Right now, in this moment, you can choose to leave Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter. You can starve them of your data and instead choose to participate with and support companies that do not steal or sell your data or collaborate with the US military-industrial complex. There are better alternatives, including Float.app, Odyssey, Minds, Junto, PeerTube, Element, Matrix, and many others. These platforms don't have all the content you might be accustomed to seeing on the big tech sites, but the sooner we encourage people to exit from these platforms and support better alternatives, the sooner we will see the content we know and love. What about getting away from big tech email, storage, maps, and other digital services? Again, there are alternatives to each of these which do not share your data with advertisers or governments. We are including some helpful links in the transcript to this documentary for anyone who seeks this information. The simple fact is that you have to make an effort to get away from big tech. It will inevitably involve changes to your lifestyle and habits. When it comes to cell phones and computer operating systems, it can be a bit more difficult and expensive to find alternatives, but they do exist. The Linux operating system has been offering consumers a non-Microsoft experience for decades, and recent years have seen the growth of cell phones which do not have Google or Apple built in. Again, we have included some tips for those seeking to move beyond the big tech paradigm. Thankfully, there are also literally hundreds of thousands of developers working on decentralized technologies, including decentralized versions of the internet itself, which have the potential to free the people from the grips of big tech. With time, the people will have more options to choose from, and the monopolistic control of our digital lives will come to an end. For those interested in diving deeper into this topic, we recommend reading Surveillance Valley from Yasha Levine, as well as the 2017 investigation by Jeff Nesbitt. We also recommend watching the documentary The Secrets of Silicon Valley from the Corbett Report. Chapter 4: The Hollywood Military Intelligence Complex. Our first attempts to understand the influence of various institutions and individuals on our world has focused on the education system, the establishment media, and big tech firms. Each of these pieces of the pyramid of power have an immense influence on the minds and decisions of people around the world. However, no other institution may have the impact of the US film industry. As we outlined in Chapter 2, the US intelligence communities have largely infected and influenced mainstream establishment media since the 1950s. This frightening trend continues with the relationship between the film industry and the US military and Central Intelligence Agency. In the early 20th century, film studios began centering their efforts around Southern California and the area that would come to be known as Hollywood. From the very outset, the US Department of Defense and intelligence community developed an interest in using the film industry as a method for shaping public opinion. Some of the first collaborations between Hollywood and the US military involved pro-World War II propaganda films like Winning Your Wings. During World War II, the US Office of War Information opened the Bureau of Motion Pictures to further their relationships with Hollywood. Between 1942 and 1945, this bureau reviewed more than 1,600 scripts and revised or abandoned projects that portrayed the US government in a bad light. According to Tanner Merlis, an associate professor of communication at Ontario Tech University and author of Hearts and Minds, the head of the Office of War Information, Elmer Davis, stated, quote, "The easiest way to inject a propaganda idea into most people's minds is to let it go through the medium of an entertainment picture when they do not realize they're being propagandized." Other historic examples of propaganda in film include the John Wayne film The Green Berets. The film was made after Wayne personally requested US President Lyndon Johnson to help him make a propaganda film about the Vietnam War. Most disturbing is the fact that the film depicted the North Vietnamese committing violent atrocities which in reality were committed by American soldiers. This is yet another example of the US government and Hollywood shaping reality for the ignorant mass consumer. The US military is not the only government agency to develop a close relationship with Hollywood. From its founding in 1947, the US CIA was involved in shaping the direction of films in a way that portrayed the agency in a positive manner or sought to remove negative associations. The CIA's predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, had already developed a knack for Hollywood films that glorified the work of the agency with films like OSS and Cloak and Dagger. After World War II, the Department of Defense developed the first entertainment liaison offices to act as conduits for US government messaging to Hollywood studios. The CIA did not publicly establish a similar office until 1996. Much of the partnership between Hollywood and the government centered around authorizing the use of military locations and access to equipment in exchange for giving the government some level of control over the final scripts. Researcher Tom Secker uncovered a 1958 memo on films for counterintelligence training involving screenings of the films The Man Who Never Was and Walk East on Beacon. The memo makes it clear that some of the Hollywood films were being used to train new recruits. Secker has also helped reveal other astounding connections between the entertainment industry and the intelligence community. In 1996, a CIA officer named Chase Brandon was hired to work directly with the Hollywood studios to rehabilitate the agency's image. Chase Brandon is also the first cousin of actor Tommy Lee Jones. Chase Brandon told The Guardian, quote, We've always been portrayed erroneously as evil and Machiavellian. It took us a long time to support projects that portray us in the light we want to be seen. Some of Chase Brandon's work involves well-known films like the 2002 Tom Clancy political thriller, The Sum of All Fears, starring Ben Affleck. The CIA gave Affleck and the filmmakers a personal tour of CIA headquarters and provided access to analysts. Chase Brandon visited the set to provide advice. He was also a regular on the set of TV show Alias, starring Affleck's then-wife, Jennifer Garner, as Sydney Bristow, an undercover agent. Garner herself would go on to film a promotional video for the CIA. In 2017, Tom Secker and Matthew Alford, professor at University of Bath, released their book National Security Cinema, providing conclusive evidence of the massive influence the US intelligence and military have exerted on Hollywood. The book is based on files obtained via open records request, which detail how the Department of Defense offered support to more than 800 films between 1911 and 2017. These films include some of the biggest pictures of their time: Transformers, Iron Man, Pirates of the Caribbean, Mission Impossible, and The Terminator. When it comes to the Transformers franchise, the DoD paid the filmmakers to gain, quote, very early influence over the scripts by giving them the most military assistance in filmmaker history, including 12 types of Air Force aircraft and troops from 4 different bases. National Security Cinema also details how more than 1,100 TV productions received backing from the Pentagon. The vast majority of these took place after 9/11, including Flight 93, Ice Road Truckers, Army Wives, 24, Homeland, and The Agency. The CIA has helped with around 60 film and TV productions since 1947. In 2017, Matthew Alford concluded, quote, when we include individual episodes for long-running TV shows like 24, Homeland, and NCIS, as well as the influence of other major organizations like the FBI and White House, we can establish unequivocally for the first time that the national security state has supported thousands of hours of entertainment. The practice of military or intelligence advisors on Hollywood films is more common than the average consumer of film might realize. In fact, even famed CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou made a living on the side by advising Hollywood. Kiriakou served on a board made up of former CIA officers, diplomats, and FBI agents who reviewed scripts about spies or terrorism to make them more realistic. However, the relationship is not simply about advising filmmakers about how to paint the US government in a favorable light. At the heart of it, the relationship helps reinforce so-called national security interests as well as shape public opinion on historic events. According to the documents, the US government has influenced movies in 3 distinct eras: 1943 to 1965, 1966 to 1986, and 1986 to the present. In the first era, film versions of George Orwell's Animal Farm in 1984 were directly affected by the CIA. During this period, a man named Luigi Larachi was the head of censorship at Paramount Studios, where he was in regular contact with an anonymous individual at the CIA. The purpose of the contact was to inform the CIA of the studio's ability and desire to change movies to meet US government expectations. For example, a 1955 film, Strategic Air Command, was changed so Americans did not appear as, quote, a lot of trigger-happy warmongering people. In 1986, the movie Top Gun started the modern era of military and intelligence influence in Hollywood films. The film served as a successful promotional film for the US Navy, with enlistment for naval aviators jumping 500%. The authors of National Security Cinema believe this success caused the CIA to update its strategy for influencing the public via films. A list of films which received advice and/or support, as well as script changes, includes The Bourne Identity, The Sum of All Fears, The Recruit, Avatar, Charlie Wilson's War, Contact, Hotel Rwanda, The Interview, The Kingdom, Lone Survivor, and Rules of Engagement. In 2016, Professor Tricia Jenkins published leaked private menus as part of her book, The CIA in Hollywood: How the Agency Shapes Film and Television. These memos show that, among others, the Osama bin Laden assassination movie Zero Dark 30 and the film Argo were heavily influenced by government officials to make the government look impressive or to downplay their mistakes. As part of the arrangement with the makers of Argo, Ben Affleck was allowed to visit CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Other actors who have visited CIA HQ include Robert De Niro, Tom Cruise, Dan Aykroyd, Dean Cain, Will Smith, Claire Danes, Kevin Bacon, Patrick Stewart, and Mike Myers.
Charlie Wilson's War is a really good example where they maintain the idea that, are we really doing the right thing by arming the Mujahideen, the forerunners of the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization in Afghanistan in the 1980s? They kind of question that in a kind of jokey way. Like the last caption in the film Charlie Wilson's War is something like, we came, we saw, but then we mucked up the end game, or some joke, It's like, no, that's not what you did actually. And you know it because the original script and the original book that you base this on doesn't say that. You armed terrorists in a really horrific conflict. It's the whole organization behind it at a systematic level.
The Department of Defense has expensive toys. They have submarines, they have aircraft carriers, they have tanks, and they have the personnel to operate each of those things. So if a filmmaker wants to make a war movie, they often will approach the Department of Defense and basically ask to borrow that equipment. And the Department of Defense will say, maybe, but can I see your script? And they will either say, this is great, we love the way that the military is portrayed in this, we will go ahead and collaborate with you. Or they may say, we hate the way that we're portrayed and refuse to participate.
The most recent example of the US military seeking to influence the public's perception via films came in early 2021 when it was revealed that the US Marine Corps played an integral role in the development of James Cameron's Avatar. Nearly 1,700 pages of documents released by the Corps' Entertainment Media Liaison Office show this relationship in action. An April 2009 report details how Hollywood liaison officers met with director and writer James Cameron. Avatar was interpreted by some critics as an anti-war film, using the alien planet as a metaphor for the US military's treatment of indigenous Americans or Iraqis. However, the documents reveal that the military viewed the film as a propaganda success, including having entertainment liaison officers invited to speak on a military panel at Comic-Con in 2011. The military liked the film so much, they arranged screenings on military bases and had actors and producers participate in a Navy entertainment program visit. Despite the wealth of information that is now available, the public is still largely in the dark about the true extent of military and intelligence involvement in the film industry. Matthew Alford has said that the Marine Corps admitted there are 90 boxes of materials in its archive. Quote, the government has seemed especially careful to avoid writing down details of actual changes made to scripts in the 21st century. What is important to take note of is the power of film and TV to shape public opinion. Researcher Tricia Jenkins notes that one of the reasons the CIA and the military desire to be involved in major films like Zero Dark 30 is because they recognize that the public will largely form their opinions of real-world events based on the fictional Hollywood retelling. In December 2019, former CIA officer turned Democrat representative Alyssa Slotkin was questioned about her favorite CIA films, and she candidly acknowledged that the CIA was helping Hollywood understand the truth about the CIA.
I mean, some movies are just total craziness and don't represent reality at all. And actually, the CIA has a whole office that will help Hollywood understand how to portray what really goes on.
Sometimes script changes requested by the government can be subtle. Like when Tricia Jenkins says the US government requested the script for the 1996 film Independence Day be changed so that the protagonist worked for the military rather than as civilians. The change is slight, but the message being delivered to the public is powerful. The military, the US government, they are the heroes. They are to be trusted and idolized. These films can reinforce the narrative that the US government and its various agencies are the authorities that care about us and can do no wrong. If the public continues to consume television and film without understanding the US military and spy agencies played a role in the finished product, they will continue to be influenced and miseducated under the guise of watching harmless entertainment. Solutions. Unplug from the Hollywood military intelligence complex. The solutions to the Hollywood military intelligence complex are simple. The easiest solution for those who seek to cleanse their minds of potential propaganda from the US military, intelligence agencies, and other pieces of the pyramid of power is to simply unplug. Unplug from the Hollywood military intelligence complex by refusing to consume their propaganda. This might be extreme for some people, but for others, it will be the appropriate solution. At the very least, take the time to become the one in control of your heart and mind. To do this, you must begin to question your assumptions and knowledge. stop to ask yourself how much of your worldview has been consciously or subconsciously shaped by what you have witnessed on television and in movies since you were a child. The more you dig and probe, you might come to realize that Hollywood has been shaping our thoughts since most of us were children and watched our first Disney movie. For example, maybe your perspective on how a mother and father are supposed to interact was heavily influenced by the sitcoms you watched as a child. Or perhaps your views on how a couple are supposed to act when they fall in love, or what clothes and styles and music are popular, were all shaped by the images flashed before your eyes on the small and big screens. The point is, the more in tune you are with your own preferences and thoughts, the more you can consume this content with a skeptical eye. This doesn't mean you can never enjoy a movie or TV show again, but it does mean you are better served by watching with discernment rather than blindly soaking it up. If we aim to be free from propaganda aimed at feeding us a biased version of history, culture, or simply selling us a product, we must take steps to reclaim our hearts and minds. By making this effort, we can be free from the Hollywood propaganda, the big tech censorship, the establishment media, and the state-run education system. To continue your research into this topic, we recommend reading National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood, and The CIA in Hollywood, How the Agency Shapes Film and Television.